I think I was quite a weird kid, quite an eccentric kid. A lot of only children do have to do a lot of imaginative work on their own. When I was 4, I asked that my middle name be changed to Glittery Pink. And that's all you need to know. No, I'm joking.
Lamorna Ash
is an award-winning writer and journalist. She's the author of Dark, Salt Clear and the brand new Don't Forget We're Here Forever. You decided to pick Christianity up as like a thing to study. Why?
Every book you write changes your life, and I was looking for a subject that felt like it had that same depth and breadth and would allow me into a community I knew nothing about.
As a Christian myself, I'm looking at it, oh, that's my tribe, or that's a different tribe. You're just then exploring almost for the first time, in a way, the weird sort of idiosyncrasies of this group of Christians versus that group of Christians.
I kind of don't want to ask you this, but do you think that Christianity is a good thing, even if it's not true?
Okay, so...
Welcome back to the Re-Enchanting podcast from Seen and Unseen. I'm Justin Brierley.
And I'm Belle Tindall.
And this is the show where we aim to re-enchant an arguably secular, disenchanted culture with the Christian vision of reality, and we do it in the company of all kinds of interesting and fascinating guests.
Yes, we do. And today is no exception. I am particularly excited to have Lamorna here. Hello.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
Oh, pleasure. So Lamorna Ash, for those of you who have not been introduced to her wondrous work yet, is an award-winning writer and journalist. She's the author of Dark, Salt Clear, Life in a Cornish Fishing Town, and the brand new Don't Forget We're Here Forever, A New Generation's Search for Religion, which has caught a huge amount of attention. Were you expecting that?
No. Someone told me, an older writer, a kind of writer I look up to, said to me a few months ago, oh, bad job that one won't go anywhere. No one's going to be interested in reading that. And I was like, yeah, probably, but it was fun to write. So yeah, it's been a very weird surprise.
I got wind of the book a few months ago because I'd seen the early article you published, a couple of years ago in The Guardian and so on, and I knew you'd sort of pursued the project. But just sort of when we booked you in, as it were, as the time approached for this interview to happen, suddenly everyone's talking about Lamorna. It's like, so something about your story seems to have captured the imagination.
And then there's the weird luck of the moment. I've got a friend who wrote a book about the history of measurement. And the week before that came out, there was like a huge revelation about the way something was calculated. Some measurement was calculated and suddenly you got this big spike. And now and then you're lucky as a writer. Yeah. And other times you're not at all.
One of the things that there was an interesting coalescence of was that your book is coming out just at the time we've had some interesting research done as well in the UK about what the Bible Society are calling a quiet revival. This idea that it turns out they've polled it and suddenly young people are coming back to church, it would appear. And so in a way, your story is kind of just so relevant to this moment that we seem to be living through. So yeah, very, very interesting. Well, before we get into all of that, our first question here in Re-Enchanting is always, because we do this on top of Lambeth Palace Library, what are you currently reading, Lamorna?
I'm always reading a couple of things at once. One thing I'm reading is Pulphead by John Jeremiah Sullivan. He's an American writer. He's just an incredible long-form journalist. And I think I really aspire to those American writers who write in places like Harper and The New Yorker, who just write the most glorious sentences whilst investigating a subject in ways that are completely surprising and compelling. And he wrote this piece about a Christian rock festival, I think it was 2004, called the Creation Festival. And he also went through, in his teenage years, a very momentary evangelical conversion. And he left his faith behind, but has all the beautiful remnants of faith. And that he could then talk to these young guys that he met whilst camping at this Christian rock festival in rural Pennsylvania about their biblical understandings. He's an outsider, but he always approaches it with this like beautiful compassion and generosity. And he talks about the fact that he has doubts about his doubts, which I think is a really good way of framing things. So he's one. And then I'm also reading, I'm reading a bit of John Stuart Mill's autobiography, which is incredible. Now, I think suddenly this sense of exploring Christianity, it's also opened me up to philosophy, or it's changed my whole way of reading, I think. And his autobiography takes some of his life, and that he was someone who a lot of people know the story that he was taught Latin and Greek when he was like 4 and had this huge breakdown when he was 20 where he knew so much, and maybe this relates to being re-enchanted. He knew so much, but he understood so little, or he had no sense of how it related to love and these bigger concepts he was coming into awareness of. And in his spiritual crisis, he suddenly had to start reading poetry, and he started reading Wordsworth, and he was like, oh, here are not answers, but things that are about longing and seeking with no answers. And so I've been reading him and really loving that.
Brilliant.
Oh, great things to be just living in.
Yeah.
We're going to get like right up to present day, I feel, because your new book kind of brings us right up to where we're at. But before that, and before we even touch upon the start of the book or anything, I kind of want to like go all the way back, rewind all the way back, because I'm just interested about like little Lamorna, which I wouldn't say, but the alliteration is too satisfying to not use that phrase. Like, and in particular, the type of stories and ideas that were in your home and around you as you were growing up, and just really sort of the things that made you in those earlier years.
Well, when I was 4, I asked that my middle name be changed to Glittery Pink. So I wanted to be called Lamorna Glittery Pink Ash.
Nice.
And that's all you need to know. No,
yeah. Did you get your wish?
No, I didn't get my wish. I didn't, unfortunately. No, okay. So as a kid, I grew up, my brothers are from my dad's second marriage and I'm from the third marriage. And what that meant was a lot of time on my own with my parents, because my brothers only came every other weekend. And my childhood was spent longing for more children. And I had my parents in my head are sort of elder parents, they had me at sort of 40. As I remember it, they were always napping, just like, and so I was often just wishing there were other people around. And what I think that gives, I know a lot of only children, and there's a lot of writer only children, that you do have to do a lot of imaginative work on your own. So a lot of my childhood, I read loads. I was really into, Philip Pullman remains one of my favorite writers in the world. But anything that was sort of fantasy, sci-fi at that age, Philip Reeve's Mortal Engines, Wolf Brothers, great books by Michelle Paver. But I did not read them as fictions. I read them as other realities, as a kind of truth. And I wrote loads of short stories, which also felt like not fiction, but creating more reality. I think I was quite a weird kid, quite an eccentric kid as well. And I think my mum really encouraged that in me. She has always been a very surreal, quite strange person. And as we'd walk through the same graveyard on the way to school every morning, she'd say, okay, we have to imagine the lives of those people as if they're still alive now. And there's probably ghosts in here. So I think I was constantly encouraged to imagine beyond what I was currently seeing as a kid.
That's so interesting.
Yeah.
Was religion, church ever part of the mix when you were growing up?
There was Church of England primary school. So, I guess I kind of imbibed a bit, but again, in this way that actually is disenchanting, because it's like you're so accustomed to that story that you don't, you're like, yeah, Jesus died and he returned, he has risen, with no sense of what that means at all, as if that isn't an extraordinary thing to be told. Or like doing the Lord's Prayer as a kid, and the idea of saying, we forgive our sins as just put it as they forgive us. It's just gone.
Forgive us our sins as we forgive those who sin against us.
Sin or trespass against us. And like the beauty of what that means is something that kids are saying every day, but again, without taking any of it in. I decided when I was like 13, 14 to get confirmed, because it's really hard to say now why, but I decided at the time, I called it a precautionary measure. And I said that to friends because I thought it was quite a good line.
That is a great line.
That is a fun line.
You were always going to be a writer, weren't you?
Maybe. I don't know. Anyway, but I remember, and you had to some classes and had this amazing RS teacher at school called Rev Barron. And she was sort of severe and wonderful and loved the poetry of Gerard Manley Hopkins. And she was one of the first wave of women who were ordained into the Church of England. And again, she never pressed her faith on us, but it meant that those classes that we did before our confirmation were, again, like steeped in or like littered with bits of poetry of John Donne, of George Herbert, rather than it just being, here's the Bible, here's what you have to learn as the kind of creeds.
Which as a literarily inspired, I suppose, person perhaps did speak to you in that way.
Yeah, or I suppose anything that felt a bit wondrous always felt good to me. Anything that you read that you're like, oh, this allows me access to something new or something different. What a thrill. I remember actually at sixth form studying philosophy and my teacher talking about the difference between the Old Testament and the New Testament and looking at proto-anti-Semitism within the New Testament, and suddenly realizing that the Bible was written by people, I think, and realizing that people have their context and their reasons for why they put certain things in, or like being told that, there's certain lines in the Old Testament that are then reincorporated into the New Testament, or, that echo it. And suddenly it felt like it was a text I could play with a little bit more. I think that was the first time I got that sense.
Yeah. And seeing it as a piece of literature as well. So them doing clever things, them being poetic, them putting things in because it's easier to memorize, them using chiastic structures, like all of that. I find that when I read the Bible, like all of those things, seeing the way their brains were working to try and communicate a truth that they knew was beyond language, but they only had language to play with. So to try and work out the way they use it language, I was like, oh man,
it's a struggle.
Yeah.
But did faith sort of take a backseat, I assume, as you went further into your teenage years and early 20s? And
yeah, totally. And I didn't get any of it at home.
Yeah.
It wasn't something I thought about. I think I didn't have any need for it. And I was very focused in my material life and what was going on with me. So I did the confirmation. I turned up in my very short dress, and I had like some very orange makeup because I've seen pictures of it. And I think there's a little bit of chrism on my forehead that I think came off on the Bishop of London at the time. And I remember thinking this is quite a sort of surreal experience. It's very cool to be in St. Paul's Cathedral to do it though. What an extraordinary space. And then, I didn't really think about it after that. I suppose the writers that I've often always loved, like I remember being really obsessed with John Donne's sermons whilst I was at university, and the way that he can often take a line and just like expand it and develop it and make it stranger for multiple pages. That felt like an extraordinary achievement. But again, I wasn't thinking about the feeling of what that faith looked like, what it did to him. I was more interested in the way he'd expressed it. So there was some cognitive thing missing for me there, I think.
So where were you at when you decided to pick Christianity up as like a topic, like a thing to study? And just why?
Yeah. Well, I'd done, it's my second book. So my first book, it was about the Cornish fishing industry, and thinking about, the things that shaped me. That book changed. I think every book you write changes your life because in the same way that every job does, but it's quite particular. So I spent this time with this fishing community, and it was a place where I grew up because I'd been like such a, kind of like cloistered teen with a very small life. And suddenly I was like out. And again, fishermen have this amazing sense of either divinity or the mystical by staring at the sea all day long, and also coming close to death a lot. I think they're very profound people. And I found it so magic, the experience of going out on all these different boats, working with them, writing about them in the evenings. I felt very changed when I came back, and I was looking for a subject that felt like it had that same depth and breadth and would allow me into a community I knew nothing about. And I just knew that two guys who both had gone to my university, and they were this comedy double act, and I'd heard that they'd converted to Christianity, and I heard that they also wanted to become priests. And I barely knew what priesthood meant. Like I know you were a vicar, you wear a dog collar. I didn't know how you become ordained, what the experience is, what the training is. And I think I thought in general, the idea of large scale changes is something that I think will always fascinate me as someone, as a writer, how someone can really alter their life, how the ground can change, how, I don't know, the backdrop behind you can change. And so as soon as I started interviewing them about their conversions, and started to like spend time with them and see that suddenly, they'd say that prayer is no longer the distraction to their days, but it is what their day is. And I thought, wow, that's so different to my experience. And at the same time, I was, living my ordinary life. And I started going to church with lots of other people. I interviewed loads of other young converts or other young people who want to become priests for this big piece I ended up writing for The Guardian. And it meant that often my working day was a Sunday, and I'd be like leaving parties early because I was like, I've got to go tomorrow really early to some church somewhere. And I was really interested that my friends were sort of bewildered and a little nervous about me engaging with Christianity. And I think that's when I was like, oh, I really want to write about this because I'm really interested in the why behind that and what I'll discover. And I think I felt that with it, anything that feels like sort of black box or like sort of shut off, that as a writer, you're like, I want to get inside. What's going on?
But did you approach that as a sort of investigative journalist sort of approach, or were you always open to the possibility this might change me in the course of investigating it?
I think the book about the Cornish fishing industry, I really did nearly take on a job as an assistant harbour master and never come back. I think there's, and I don't know, I guess in anthropology that there's that kind of, I guess like now really outdated term of like the idea of going native, where you are then absorbed into the community you're writing about, which is just a deeply human thing that you spend your days alongside people. If you're porous enough, you will be changed by them. And I think I knew that about myself. And I think even in these two guys that I've been interviewing who had very different forms of faith to what I ended up pursuing more in the book, but I still had this sense that there's something there that would be so exciting to attain, or the question of can everyone get a bit of that?
I think that's what I really enjoyed, actually, now that you've put it that way about the book. It's this very open-ended way in which you write, where we genuinely feel like we're on the journey with you. And lots of bits of the book are literally about a journey in a train or whatever. But you get the sense that, you're not quite sure where you're going to land, and you're sort of like, I just really enjoyed that sort of sense of being in your mind as you're tussling with the kind of challenge or the oddity or the whatever of the different Christians you're meeting along the way. And as a Christian myself, I suppose I'm looking at it from a sort of that's my tribe or that's a different tribe, but sort of the way in which you're just then exploring almost for the first time in a way, these are the weird sort of idiosyncrasies of this group of Christians versus that Christian. It's just really fun in a way, but also I think really helpful as a sort of roadmap almost for people who maybe have no clue about Christianity. You kind of are a helpful kind of explorer going ahead of them to sort of make sense of it.
Well, I have that. People always think about who are you writing for? And I guess I am much more often writing for my friends. It's been a real delight to give them the book, because I think a lot of them think strange things must be going on to me that they don't know about, because I disappear for an hour every Sunday. And in fact, when they read the book, they're like, oh, it's still you. I get it. I get you going on. I understand. And something for them to be like, oh, I now see the difference between some of the different Protestant denominations, which I definitely didn't know before writing it. But I think the real beauty of getting to be a writer where you go into something you don't know about is that you then do get to engage in each space and be like, and this sense of a road trip. I was in my very old Toyota Corolla that has now died, rest in peace to it. But I would then turn up in a place and be like, okay, new again. And I'd have a little bit more, and I'd have the residue of the last thing, or like a sense of, at least I can understand a bit more about the way a service works. But then I'd be confronted with something completely different. And that, felt very exciting. And I think also where it's left me now, I've been hanging out with quite a lot of Catholics recently, but also Quakers again. And I really have this sense, and this is probably like a terrible thing to say and sacrilegious to so many different denominations, that I kind of can't see why I shouldn't be able to go to a different form of denomination service every week. I don't know if that's messed up.
I don't. I mean,
or sometimes
in a funny way, what your book brings out is that there are so many flavors of Christianity, inevitably. And obviously you find yourself somewhere at the end of the book yourself, and we'll probably come to that. But it's a sort of, I think what I appreciated about it was you weren't sort of condemning, saying, well, this is the right one. You were just aware that everyone, for whatever reasons of their past and their experience, finds themselves at different places and the place that often is right for them, but may not be right for everyone. So I just appreciated the way you did that. And I think actually it would be really good for Christians to visit expressions that are not their own, because I think it does open your eyes a little bit to the fact that this story is a bit bigger than just the version I've kind of imbibed. My wife is a minister of a church, and when she went to university, we met at university, she took the opportunity to visit every different type of thing. So she went to chapel, at the college, but she went to the big evangelical charismatic church, but she went to the little Methodist church, and she went to the, and I think that was really good, because it was one of those moments in your life where, okay, let's just see. And it sort of opened up the world in a different way to just sort of staying in the lane she'd already had.
I write about someone like that in my book, who was maybe one of the people I met who I found him completely extraordinary, but I interviewed him right at the start of the research period, down in Sussex near the coast. And it's almost like I wasn't ready for all the things he was telling me about, because he has this quite extraordinary sense of what he sees as the kind of false binary of atheism and faith. And he thinks that, they're just modes of perspective, but there is some kind of truth beyond that we're all trying to get towards. And he talked about that he had this sudden conversion, a conversion in nature. You know, I met people who were converted by paintings, or I met people who were converted by reading Julian of Norwich's Revelations of Divine Love. But for him, it was just walking through a line of trees, and he suddenly felt the whole universe smile at him. And he thought, oh no, there's a God. And he then had to join the Christian Union. And he was like, I'm going to have to admit all these things that I really didn't think I'd have to deal with. I was the kind of cool atheist in my year. And he went to university and he did exactly that. He went to every single kind of service because he was like, I want to wrestle with all of it. I want to feel what it's like. And I don't need a particular allegiance to this, but I probably am going to need as much information as possible. And he talked about being very moved by going, you know, one of his summer holidays, he went to Israel and he went to, I can't remember the church, the Holy Sepulchre. And in there, he heard a Christian service in Arabic and the Christian God being described as Allah. And it was this like beautiful, like syncretic moment for him about everything combining and understanding the similarity, the congruences between the Abrahamic faiths. And I found that, I was like, oh, that's very cool.
Yeah.
That's very exciting to me.
It makes, like, listening to the way you talk about Christianity now and the way you spoke about the novels you read when you were younger and the short stories, it makes total sense that when you saw this odd thing that was Christianity, it felt, I don't know, did it kind of feel the same, like a new world where you're like, oh, I didn't know this existed. This is a new place to go, a new place to explore. I think definitely, I've always been a Christian. I was born into a Christian family, but as a teenager, I felt like the opposite. Like I lived in a parallel world that I couldn't let my friends see because I was super embarrassed about it when I was, well, up until very recently, actually. So it makes total sense why, like, you saw this stuff happening, almost like hidden in plain sight. Did it feel a little bit like that?
Yeah, definitely. I always think that now on a Sunday morning where, say, that all over the country, I mean, all over the world, everyone is entering into these church spaces and sort of disappearing into a different place that anyone could access, but might not. But I think I have the sense now, it's changed my sense of time entirely because I have a really different sense of history, because I think it's that thing, when you write about the Cornish fishing industry, there's actually like a small amount of research that's necessary. And some of it is incredibly dry when you're learning about sort of fish quota history. With Christianity, it's totally endless. It really is like, I'm like, how much theology am I going to have to read? And I'm going to have to read so many history books. I barely knew about the English Civil Wars, and now it's probably like my favourite period in history. Apparently there's a big revival and interest in the Civil Wars at the moment. I don't know, that's going alongside the Quiet Revival. Who knows what's in the waters. But suddenly thinking, okay, and then this moment of this huge shift where Quakers emerge, where all these different strange reformers come in. And it was like a new world opening up for me, but at the same time it wasn't. It was my world, but gaining this like rooting that I didn't know was there.
And very Tom Hollandy of you.
Yeah, it kind of feels like that. And his book was obviously so foundational for me for writing.
Yeah.
But with that was sort of, it then starts opening up to different faiths as well. Like I've been interviewing Buddhists quite a lot recently, and again, totally different framework. And yet still this sense of, I've become more conscious of the beautiful, necessary strangeness of believers' eyes. And I think once that's like a lens that's opened up to me now, where I can be like, okay, so you're thinking about the particular Yidam, this like deity you're praying towards, that kind of reminds me of that person. I think, it's made my life feel a lot more expansive in lots of ways.
Yeah.
As you went on this journey then, and you started to purposefully put yourself into those spaces, lots of different Christian spaces, sometimes through like a retreat, through maybe going on a course or whatever. What were some of the things you found? What jarred with you? What kind of appealed to you? I know that like in the first chapter or two, you do talk about going on the Christianity Explored course, which is in the more kind of conservative evangelical end of the church. And so the initial response, the initial kind of impression I had, chapter 1 was, oh, this isn't going to go well. Lamorna doesn't like this too much. But then but then you come back and reflect on that later, because you're obviously learning a lot as you go along. And so when you reflect on that a bit later, you process it in a slightly different way. So just what was the journey like as you started to engage these different traditions?
Yes, it did feel like to begin with, I was experiencing a lot more of conservative forms of Christianity. And I felt frustrated as a writer and just as a person on this journey, because I was seeing what I thought I was going to see. And I'd really hoped to find more than that.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I say that. So Christianity Explored, for example, what jarred with me was like a literalist reading of the Bible, because the difference between what we're being told was that, you read the Bible and it will just convert you. And I didn't even know quite what that meant, although I know people definitely since who have converted by like a single line of the Bible. But even then on the table, the way we were talking about the Bible, as soon as you're sitting and being like, wait, like there was a legion of demons in that person and Jesus put them out into pigs, that's extraordinary and strange. And it meant that suddenly I was starting to see the ambiguity, and I was meeting people in the way they actually wrestled with faith, like a young woman who had decided to convert because she'd fallen in love with a Christian. And I was like, well, that I can absolutely understand, making a move like that, and the beauty of how she was trying to reshape her life through that. So each place I went to, even when it jarred with me, there was always something surprising and welcoming, or something I could empathize with.
And I got that in all of the encounters, even where it was clear this wasn't going to be your home, as it were, like on the Walsingham Catholic thing. But you still found the people who you understood, and it was the humanity very often that I think you kind of took from those situations.
Yeah, which again is the joy of getting to do this kind of thing, is that you do just get to meet extraordinary people, and I'm always grateful for that.
Yeah.
And because they do sort of move you and change you, and sometimes you have to press against things that, again, if I didn't do this kind of work, I would be quite happy in my small world. And it's really exciting when someone tries to confront your sense of reality and slightly like reform it. Another thing that jarred though, and I really don't have an answer to this, is that more charismatic or Pentecostal forms of worship, I find it really difficult. It doesn't, I just can't. And again, like maybe it's some like really British repressed bit of me. I'm not really sure, although I love to dance, so it's hard to say. But that I think I was confronted by people who are, being moved by the Holy Spirit and being slandered by the Holy Spirit, and not slandered, being
slain in the Spirit. Yeah.
And not being slandered. The Holy Spirit wouldn't slander you. Sorry.
He's way too nice for that.
Yeah, exactly. Sorry, wow. Friday afternoon. And kind of seeing someone, speaking in tongues and that stuff. I think because it is just this more ecstatic, surprising, challenging form of Christianity. And I think now I'm getting closer to being like, I appreciate it, but it's very different from how I'd.
Did you feel sort of uncomfortable in those
felt
situations?
Deeply uncomfortable, but not in a way of like being threatened at all by the fact of other people moving that way, but just like, I guess I felt embarrassed to be in the space because I felt like I was sort of getting in the way.
Right.
There's something about being
intruder.
And I was I was at Youth with a Mission, which is in kind of Bible training school, and also people live there. It's a community as well. I was at the one in Harpenden, and I was sat right at the front for the service. Two young people moved me up. They're like, "What's at the front? It might go on for hours." And I was like, "Oh no!" And then immediately people, up off their seats. And because I wasn't a Christian, the church I had been to, it was a very different form, very traditional Anglican. I didn't know how to respond to it, and people weeping, and it just felt like it felt an intense and a lot. But I think, again, going back to that book I've been reading, Pulphead, about this Christian rock festival, he does this too, where he's like able to watch it and say, wow, that means so much to them. And I'm going to write about it. And sometimes I'm going to find it a bit funny and a bit weird, because it is a bit funny, it is a bit weird, and it is unusual. But that is not to devalue it or invalidate it.
Yeah. You, at one point in your book, you liken like conversion experiences in particular to falling in love. And I would just love you to break that open, because I thought that was a really interesting and like astute observation.
I was thinking about it that with falling in love, how should I put it? That once you didn't love the person you do now, like once that there wasn't the existence of that person as this like North Star to you, and then suddenly they come into your life and it does reshape and change everything. And it's the kind of closest, I think, secular experience to the idea of what faith and belief can feel like. I also have this slightly like mystical sense of a lover is a glimpse of love as an eternal concept, that it's like a way of tapping into that. And that's why I often think that actually with faith, a human encounter is like a glimpse at this like greater sense of what God might be as well.
Yeah.
But I think I also was interested that I met, people who've lost their faith, and that way that again, you lose love and you're like, that person was everything. I said I wanted to be with them for the rest of my life. And then for various like difficult, painful reasons, they're no longer there. And I thought that was just like an interesting way to think about it. But yeah, I've definitely found the experience of falling in love is there's nothing more destabilizing.
Yeah.
And also opening. I think, suddenly you have this like other voice in your head because you start to move alongside this person who is giving you a whole other way of looking at things and taking this whole other journey. So I thought that was useful.
Yeah.
I also saw this clip this morning, like an old BBC clip when they do these like lovely archival ones. And it's a little kid and the kid is being asked about what love is. And kids often give the best answers because they haven't had it and they're not kind of, as deeply disappointed by love as some of us are when we're older or whatever. They haven't had that demythologizing of it. And this kid though said, love is when one person or two people like each other too much. And I thought that was really fascinating.
Yeah.
As this idea of it, like excess and too much and beyond what
what's
is
sensible.
good for us. Yeah, sometimes. And I was thinking, but belief is, like the idea of being beyond what is ordinary and therefore requiring that leap as well. Love is a leap. It requires two people to believe. If one of you stops believing, it all falls away. And
I've often felt like probably a romantic relationship is the obvious analogy to faith because, when I've been in those kind of moments where you're doing a dialogue with a hardened sort of skeptical atheist, the natural place to go is, well, do you love your partner or your wife or whatever? Because that's something other than just sort of hard scientific material facts. It's a trust in someone, despite the fact they could let you down, it could go wrong, and yet we invest ourselves into it. And it feels to me like that's more like what faith is than a sort of rational, yes, of course I believe in God because of X, Y, Z. It's a sort of I don't really know exactly how this all works, but I felt something and I'm just going to kind of trust it.
Yeah. And it must be enacted as well. Love is something that you perform and continually. And I met someone, this like great Catholic who I met in Cambridge, and he's an academic as well. And he was saying, that you make yourself a believer each day by enacting that belief. And for Catholicism, that's the rituals that you do to make that faith an embodied thing, which I think is really interesting. And he said to me, he was like, you can't just say I'm a dutiful person. You showed your dutiful qualities by acting. And I think love is like that too. And I think that's, there's such a difference between, say, infatuation and love. And maybe there's something as well about, maybe you could play that with faith and like the desire for faith. But infatuation, where it's all promises and it's like, it's going to be the most extraordinary thing ever, but there's no reality to it because it's not lived out.
So when did you start to feel the first pangs of love, for want of a better word, when you did start to encounter traditions and ways into faith that felt more like, okay, I can get on board with this?
So after these first few months of quite sporadic interviews or doing Bible studies classes or going off to places like Youth for the Mission, I'd said to someone who was Christian, I was like, I'm just finding it really hard to manage my life, my daily secular life against these quite extraordinary, strange encounters I'm having. And I don't really know, I feel like I'm kind of flip-flopping constantly. And my friend said, well, why don't you go on some Christian retreats? That's kind of what they're there for. A place where you can really be saturated in the Christian faith for a bit. So I booked a few. And again, I quite a scatty, I think I wouldn't really, I don't know, the kind of journalist who's like really like careful about this stuff. I'm like, okay, I'm just going to book something. And I had Iona in the Hebrides, and I had a Triduum retreat, like an Easter retreat in Walsingham, and a Jesuit retreat in North Wales. And the first one in Iona, I think that was the first time I felt this idea of like, faith as a kind of pang, or as a, what Blaise Pascal says of that some people can only get faith by reason, and for others, they get it through the heart.
Yeah.
And I think faith felt like, it's funny because, it was this like, this thing that comes and goes at the weather for me. And I was in Iona and I'd been having a terrible time in my life, as mid-20s chaos in lots of different directions. And I got there, and it's, the church itself is unbelievably beautiful. It's an old stone that's been there for hundreds of years. And there's this incredible, like wild geese fly overhead whilst you're in the service. And this like beautiful St. John's cross, there's sort of glints, and then you have these services in the dark. And the Iona, I'm sure lots of people know the Iona prayer book. It has this real simplicity to the style of it. And I think I needed that. It like cut through to me, the things they were saying, the things that I got to say through those services and those sort of call and response parts. And the kind of people that, Iona, they have this, their faith is like founded on, or their work is about social justice. And I found the young people who were volunteering there so moving in the way they enacted their faith. And I'd be there just in every service crying. And then it was the work weeks. Then I'd be out in the gardens, surrounded by the sea, and we'd get 100 different weather types in like an hour. And we were encouraged to look up from our work and think about where God was in it. And it was just things I hadn't done before, practices I hadn't tried. And for that week, I guess, away from my life, I kind of felt like, oh, I could be a believer. I'm in this church every day. This is really moving.
Well, as you say, and it's a lovely, lovely chapter where you describe this retreat you had on the island of Iona in the Abbey there. You said for the first time you found yourself wanting to go to church. It was like, okay, so you were, so, and you say you were crying at every service. I mean, what was coming out in that sort of
Yeah, I
moment?
think sometimes of prayers or church services are sort of escape valves that, you know,
Yeah.
we walk around mostly in our daily lives having to put on various kinds of fronts for lots of people. I really feel that getting older, you know, there's people that you have to look after who aren't so well. There's like spaces within work. And if you're not careful, that shell can become pretty hard, and it can be hard to find spaces where you can actually let that go. And for me, a church service is just, I think it's like Philip Larkin says that, you know, it's a serious house, a serious ground for
serious house
There we
built
go.
on serious ground.
Yeah,
like
there we
that.
go.
Yeah,
And that sense of seriousness, that it's a space for sincerity, and everything about the way that hymns are written, or what it's like to read Psalms, where Psalms are this like deep, profound, and immediate expression of human emotion in all different directions. And it's almost like that then legitimizes you to experience that too. So I think with that and the sense of it being communal as well, and the beauty of an actual church too, all of it seemed to say to me, hey, you can kind of let go a bit here.
Yeah.
And I just think churches are good for weeping. I mean, there's spaces where you go to celebrate.
They're kind of set apart, aren't they? And I
Yes.
love that the way you describe it in a later chapter. You say all around you, it turns out, are these buildings which are kind of for a very specific purpose, and you could walk into it at any moment, but most people never do.
Yeah.
But they're there to kind of where you can access something completely different from the supermarket or the business or the whatever, which have their
Or
place.
the busy street or
but
the
a church is, especially the ones that are just open and can be walked into, that they're a kind of untapped treasure almost.
I had a really particular example of that recently, where one of my friends, it was the anniversary of their friend's death, who died very young, and they were feeling really upset, and they texted me and they were like, can't we like go to a church? Don't you go to a church? And I was like, oh yeah, cool, okay. And we just met sort of both of us on our lunch breaks outside my church, and it was closed, and I was like, oh no. And then I texted one of the priests, or the associate priest from my church, and he was like, oh no, someone's in there, they can let you in. And in we went, and it's this beautiful, well, it's not even that beautiful, it's just like a lovely standard Victorian church. And they lit a candle on the altar for us, gave us a little votive candle so that my friend could light it off the main altar candle. And she said to us, the person who works in the church, Tina, she was like, you can just stay for as long as you want. And suddenly the two of us were just sitting in this church for like an hour and a half, and my friend did cry a bit, and we talked about the person who died, and then we talked about lots of other things besides, and it just felt like, oh, that's what this is for, and everybody should be able to access this. I mean, in whatever holy house or form of religion they want to, but these spaces that are designed for seriousness and big, difficult things.
Were you, because you had observed like so much, and like you say, you'd observed conversions as quite a dramatic thing, quite a night and day thing, like a before and after type of thing. Does that mean that when you were starting to experience like a strangely warmed heart, as I think John Wesley put it, was there any fear there in that? I know that even for me, like sometimes I'll be like, this is so real, it's going to demand so much of me. And it does demand so much of me. And sometimes I can find that overwhelming. Did you at all, when it was starting to like brush against your own deepest longings, and it was starting to speak into your deepest fears, like all of that, was there an element of like, oh no?
There probably was, in the moment itself, like at Iona, or say when I was with the Jesuits in North Wales, in the moment it just felt like an unlocking and an opening, and that felt beautiful, and it felt like a relief, and it felt like getting closer to myself. Then afterwards I'd be sort of estranged from it and think, oh, whoa, what was that? I'm not really sure about that.
Yeah,
but I
that
think,
makes sense.
and maybe again, I do think that what I realized by interviewing so many different kinds of people is that so much of it is like individual context based, of like the kind of faith that can enter different people. So I'm not sure I'd ever be someone who had this sudden conversion in a moment. I'm not sure I have access to that. I sort of wish I do, because I think it's immense and quite amazing and quite astonishing. But for me, it was more this gradual filling of a well or something like that.
Yeah.
And it's funny in thinking about it, because I know that, so many people say that, where it's like, oh gosh, these new demands, I'm going to have to change in so many ways. And perhaps it's because I am still in a place of like more doubt than anything else, that I haven't experienced that of like, maybe what I've felt is when I go to church, it's a reminder of what I already thought I was required to be, which is like a person who's like tries to be moral and ethical and think about the world and realizes that all human beings around you matter loads. And so sometimes it does say to me, like, it makes me think, come on, like, how do you actually want to live each day? But apart from that, it doesn't seem to have turned me so far from my life that I'm afraid.
Yeah. I wonder if there's a huge amount of circumstance that goes into these things as well, in that my family happened to be Christians when I was born into it. So I too don't have a before and after and on and off. I always think like, where some people just like cannonball into the sea of faith, I'm definitely wading in from the shore like every day. Do you think then some personalities are more predisposed to religious experience than others?
So my guide for this is William James, who wrote The Varieties of Religious Experience, which is just an unbelievable book. And actually, if any book was taught me how to write about Christianity, it was that book, because he's a turn of the century psychologist, brother of Henry James, but I think Henry James is the lesser James, because William James is really extraordinary. And what he does is he goes all over the place, both within his own research and other people's research, to find examples of people who've had religious experience, which for him is a kind of experience that feels beyond our ordinary human mode of human perception, something that strikes us as like unusual and a kind of like rupture in the way that time normally progresses. And he's, again, so generous about that. And a lot of the people that he does speak about, he describes them as more porous bordered, and not all of us are. And some people, more things can get through to us. And I think that's a really good way of thinking about it. And he also talks about the healthy souls and the sick souls, and healthy souls who already have this sense of reality that's fine and therefore quite robust about things aren't going to require strange things to enter through to them. Whereas sick-souled people sort of need to be converted or saved by something. And so maybe are more predestined to have these like quite intense religious experiences. I definitely found that people who are, more porous bordered, maybe more vulnerable, maybe have been through something that is incredibly challenging, like maybe an alcohol addiction or drug addiction, or have just ended up like lost on the other side of something and are incredibly lonely, might be more likely to have these more immediate conversions and more open to that. And yet some people, it really does strike them from nowhere. But I think in a way, you do require this openness. I was thinking about this in terms of when I went to Walsingham. So Walsingham is, I think, the only place where the Virgin Mary has come to the UK, or come to Britain at least, in like the 12th century. She touched down and this woman had this vision from Mary, and Mary said, you need to rebuild a version of the house where the angel Gabriel came to, that I had that visitation. And I was wondering if all of us again have access to these very strange visions, and like what kind of beings are coming down and we're just not listening to them in our dreams. And I don't know. Sometimes I like to play with those ideas. I'm not sure how far I believe them or no, but I kind of like the idea that you have to be looking up and attending to the world. Someone said to me that you don't get transcendence without boredom. And I was thinking about that in terms of our generation of, I'm barely bored. I mean, I may be very bored, but I'm always on my phone, and therefore I'm not bored in this kind of like slow way. And perhaps I'm less like to have remarkable, strange things happen.
In a funny way, that links into a place where you did find yourself quite frequently on a Sunday, which is in the Quaker tradition. And you went along to sort of, I think, your local Quaker church. I don't know if you wouldn't call it a church,
meeting house,
a meeting house, friends. And there, I will admit, I've never been to a Quaker, but I think you described it very well in the book. It's based in silence, essentially. And anyone can speak as they feel led, but that it was quite rare in the particular meeting house that you were at. So a lot of the time was simply spent in silence, listening. And in a way, you can understand why that alone is challenging to us we're in a massively distracted age, but also potentially gave you the space to just confront yourself because you're not kind of constantly being distracted. So what did you find helpful, difficult about that experience of trying to encounter Christian faith? And I suppose in the end, why didn't you stay there? Because I mean, Belle and I, I was thinking, oh, she's probably going to become a Quaker, but you didn't become a Quaker.
Yeah.
What were the things that did detract you initially to it?
I'm quite surprised that there seems to be like lots of people talk about the book and it's like almost as if it's a cliffhanger. This sort of very, is she going to be a Quaker? Very low stake cliffhanger. But so I went to the Quaker meeting house in Muswell Hill because my granny used to go there for a bit when my dad was young, and I thought, outside, I wanted some kind of religious routine whilst I was writing the book, because again, I was like, I've got to engage with this properly. I'm within this book a lot, and I need somewhere that I can go back to. And I think the Quakers are quite a beautiful entry point into Christianity because it lacks, particularly maybe if you come from maybe a space of Christianity that maybe felt traumatic as a kid, like maybe a place that was homophobic, or I don't know, for lots of different reasons, and you want to like go on something at the fringes of Christianity. Although it's not a fringe, it's a whole denomination. It's still, there's no preaching, there's no hierarchy within there.
There's no particular, as far as I understand it, demands upon even any specific creedal beliefs. I mean, you can have an atheist who's just as much.
There's quite a lot of atheists. There's a growing group of atheist Quakers. I interview one. Yeah, you don't. And so the way, and to bring up the Civil Wars again, but the Quakers grew out to that period in the mid 17th century. And actually at the beginning, they're called the Quakers because they were not quiet at all. They absolutely shook, and they'd feel the Holy Spirit move, or what they call the inner light move through them. And it would compel them to speak, and anyone could speak, and women could minister for the first time, really, within the British tradition of Christianity. And then they went through this kind of quietist period after the what's the word? Restoration.
After the Reformation.
Restoration.
Okay.
They, since then, have always been quite silent. And this thing of, again, not having a priest within it, and not having any kind of creeds. But the one I went to, it was mostly much older people, and you sit there, and I just found that, it was really disorienting or kind of surprising or confronting to me to just have to be in silence. And there's a Bible in the center, so sometimes I would read from bits of the Bible, and I would try and do something a bit like Lectio Divina, where I would read a few lines over and over again. Or I would just sit with my own thoughts, and sometimes that was deeply uncomfortable because I'm not used to doing that. And sometimes someone would stand up and say something really profound, and sometimes no one would speak at all, and often no one spoke at all. And I met other Quakers who go to the Quaker Meeting House in Euston, and it's much more buzzy. And my friend who goes, Lawrence, who I write about in the book, he talks about this idea of needing to be undone by others within the silence. He quotes this philosopher, Emmanuel Levinas, that you were there together by having all screens away, literally and metaphorically. And when someone speaks, you have to take what they are saying to you and be undone or transformed by it. And that's like the demand within Quaker meetings. So rather than it being like a liturgical demand, it's that kind of, it's a human to human demand. And I started to see bits of that through the Quakers that he goes with, and that they all go to loads of protests as well, because they can feel through reading the Quaker advice and queries that it talks about this like need to protect the earth, need to protect each other. But in the silence itself, you were there like a vigil, just thinking. And then afterwards, it's like what you then go and do with that in the world. But the reason I didn't stay in the end in the Quaker Meeting House was because I think, again, having been brought up with no faith, I had no armature of belief. Like I think I started to have the sense that, one, I needed something to wrestle with. I needed to hear scripture in the way of like an Anglican or a Catholic communion or any kind of other forms of Christian denominations that are a bit more rigorous with the way that the structure works. And I wanted to hear sermons where people tried to make sense out of these extraordinary
You wanted
words.
a bit more meat.
I wanted some more meat, and I wanted some bread and wine. I wanted to something to hold on to, I think.
Yeah.
And I also had the sense within the Quaker meeting I was going to, that again, that throughout the experience of writing the book, I was going through quite a difficult time emotionally. And it was really easy to slip away at the end. For some reason, there was you shake hands to terminate the silence at the end of a Quaker meeting. And they were the loveliest people, but I somehow didn't feel like it was asking very much of me, and I could always just walk away.
Right.
And then I had a friend who was a Quaker who said, oh, well, when I find it hard to feel my God come down in Quaker meetings, those days where I feel too insulated to have that experience of the inner light, I go to a more noisy service at this place in North London. And I realised as I was listening back to the interview, I was like, oh, that's like 10-minute cycle from me. And I went there. It was a 9 a.m. service, and I hadn't checked on the notice board or the kind of internet notice board that it was only one 9 a.m. service a month. But I happened to turn up on the right 9 a.m. service, and I went in, and there was about 4 people. And even then, I had this sense of this friendliness and seriousness of this church, of this thoughtful, intelligent scriptural readings. That it wore kind of its liberal qualities really openly. It was very queer affirming, trans affirming, all the things that, you know, not everyone needs that for a church, but I guess I needed that. And I went back the next week, and at the piece, it takes like 20 minutes because everyone shakes everyone's hands. And sometimes you'll hear, rather than 2 scriptural readings, it'll be like a Bob Dylan song from a sort of particular Christian phase, or I don't know, there were so many different things happening within it. And I thought, this is sort of what I've been looking for, and it's so intergenerational. I think I'll keep on going here for a bit.
And it was 10 minutes down the road from you.
Exactly, yeah.
What does, both professionally, I guess, although it'd be hard to tie a bow on it professionally, so maybe it's actually easier to answer personally. What does belief, like, if I was to put that in like quotation marks, what does that look like for you? What do you understand that word to even mean after these last few years?
For me, it's an attempt. Like, belief is an attempt at something. It's something that, for me, I can't grasp permanently, but it's something to aspire towards in lots of different directions. I guess I'm thinking about it I'm trying to think about it just in terms of faith.
Yeah.
I think I still find it really challenging to say different things that one might say about what it means to believe in different aspects of Christianity. But I find it something that I really admire in others. I think I'm really amazed by the idea of belief in other people. I think, what else do I think about it? Yeah, that I think it for me, it goes hand in hand with doubt, that doubt and faith, doubt and belief are kind of necessary bedfellows. And maybe I have more to say about doubt, because I think, you know, again, like reading the Psalms or Jared Manley Hopkins, that there's doubt and faith entwined, or doubt and belief in every single one of those poems. And there's this constant oscillation. I like the power of the phrase, I believe. It, to me, to say that I believe in things is making a kind of Kierkegaardian leap in lots of different directions. And I can think about it maybe in my non-religious life of, you know, things like when I get to say, I don't know, I believe in like the inviolable human dignity of someone else. I believe in the importance of trans rights. These things, believe is a really powerful word that feels important and feels personal and feels like a stake. You're putting a stake in something, you're having a stake in something, and that feels vital.
Right. It's like, I know it, and I'm going to let my knowing of it move me like in a direction. I'll let it fuel me.
There's a line. So I spoke to this amazing pastor for the process of writing the book, and she told me that sometimes even as a pastor, she was like, oh God, I don't know if I believe right now. I'm such a shit pastor and I'm a shit Christian. And when she feels that, she loves a line from a gospel, which is, Lord, I believe, help my unbelief. Which contains all of that even, and that's, I think it really opened up to me what the word believe means, which is maybe like I long to believe, or I need to believe, or I hope to get to believe. And I found that quite striking too. And that it's a belief, it's an appeal as well. Lord, I believe, please.
Help me.
I mean, this, you know, whenever you write a book, you're sort of saying, here's where I'm at now, and who knows where the journey may continue to take you. I'm sure, you know, but what's interesting to me is, you know, you're coming at a moment when in fact there's this interesting research that I mentioned earlier that where it feels like there is a bit of an uptick of interest in Christian faith among even young people, the demographic that's most frequently sort of not present in many churches. And at the same time, and I've seen a number of people, you know, in the run up to this interview sort of sharing quite enthusiastically some of the articles and things that you've been featured on. But I was also thinking at the back of my mind, not all the Christians I know will necessarily feel totally comfortable where you've ended up, in particular, Lamorna, which is in a more kind of progressive kind of tradition, where there is a lot of openness to sexuality and gender and everything else. And obviously you encountered people in all different facets of this as you went along. This is where you find yourself now. In fact, it made me think of the fact that we're coming up to the kind of Christian summer festival season. And you could almost find all the different expressions you write about in the book in the different festivals that are now on offer. You'll get your charismatic evangelical festival in New Wine. You'll get your conservative evangelicals at the Keswick Convention. And it didn't surprise me that the festival you'll be at this summit is the Greenbelt Festival, which is kind of encompasses a lot of those more progressive sort of social justice oriented sort of traditions and churches. I mean, within all of that, how do you kind of put that all together, given that it's such a broad tent that all these Christian sort of manifestations of Christianity sit in? And how do you, I suppose, what would you say to the person who says, well, Lorna, I'm pleased you've been on the journey, but you've landed in a place which I'm just not personally comfortable with, because I don't go with you on the sexuality and gender stuff. I've found myself somewhere different in a more traditional place, for instance. And lots of people you spoke to were obviously in a different sort of camp to you in that.
Yeah.
respect.
Oh, I have loads of things to say on that. I guess firstly, it's not traditional to believe that gay people shouldn't have sex. There's like been moments, if you read Dermot McCullough's book, Lower Than the Angels and the History of Sexuality and Christianity, there have been these strange moments where there's been more space and more tolerance towards queer people having sex, and then less space. And that, that I think what I found quite exciting about my experiences of reading Christian history is that there actually hasn't been one line all the way through. There's been constant divergences. I guess I would say to the person who said that to me, yeah, sure, it's a wide church and there's many places you can end up, and maybe we all need each other. That thing, you could take it into thinking about the need for diverse ecosystems or biological ecosystems. Perhaps you need a diverse church of different forms of faith that are in speak to one another. I think it would be a disappointing thing for someone to tell you you're not a good enough believer because you don't hold to certain tenets. That feels deeply unimaginative to me. I think I believe it's a terrible shame when I've gone to certain services and all they talk about is sexuality, when I've discovered so much strangeness in Christianity. I think also I love someone very practically said to me, when I sleep with my partner, I can feel that there's nothing inherently wrong in that. Though often I learn about the world experientially. I know when I've caused people harm by the cruel things that I do, because, we all can. And I know the spaces that actually feel beautiful and joyous. And, we're all working out through experience. And the best thing about getting to voyage between things is you get to see different answers people have. But I guess I like the fact that I'm a character within my book, and I, like every person I interview, end up somewhere. And I feel really grateful where I am now, which is still, as I said, constant periods of doubt, but with this church community where I can at least think, and it's all a TBC for me in terms of what happens with that, but it feels exciting to be on the journey. So I'm glad to be on the journey too, but I couldn't have ended up elsewhere, I think.
We should start bringing this to land, even though I can tell we've both got 1,000 more questions. But I kind of don't want to ask you this because I don't want you to feel like your belief needs to be anywhere other than where it is. But what I noticed about myself when I read your book was basically, I think when other people who I have less overlap with, like politically or whatever, people like Jordan Peterson, right, who speaks about Christianity all the time, and yet so he's like this big representative, and yet if you say to him, so do you believe in Jesus? He'll be like, I was about to do an impression, and I'm definitely not going to do
what do you mean by Jesus?
Oh gosh, that's good.
And then it's like, oh, well then stop talking about it, stop talking about us. But
oh well, yeah.
So basically, I think what I want to ask you is, do you think that Christianity is a good thing even if it's not true?
Okay, so with that, I guess I think there's loads of different layers for the word truth. That if there's like literal truth, and there's, I think you need a different understanding of truth and untruth in order to understand Christianity anyway, that it's operating on a different level from your ordinary level of experience.
Sure.
I think the teachings within the Bible, so much of it, there is this like inherent goodness of like the corporeal works of mercy, or whatever, the parable of the sheep and the goats, and these ways that, or love your neighbor, ways that teach you how to live, that whether the resurrection or the aspects of Jesus being the Son of God were real, the like amazing radical nature of what he taught would still have power. But I think again, it's like my sense of truth is something that comes and goes, so that I can feel in the space for church closer to that sense of like believing in God and therefore believing in a Christian God and therefore believing that this is not just a man on earth who said some extraordinary things, but something so much more remarkable and radical than that, that changed the entire future of the world. That's what an extraordinary thing to believe in. And for that to be true in that moment feels like reaching into sublimity. I think it's already changed the world enough that you could say the goodness of what Christianity is deeply embedded in our world. Yeah. I'm not really answering it though, whether then it's still good. I think it probably would be, but I think, again, when I this book I was reading, Pulpit, that I keep going back to, but Jeremiah Sullivan, he talks about what it meant to lose his belief, that afterwards he was like, it doesn't feel good enough to me to say, you know, just it's taught us loads about how to be generous and kind, the Christian message. Once you've had the extraordinary, amazing capacity to know that Jesus is the Son of God, everything else feels a bit lackluster. And so even if he doesn't believe it, and even if he's lost his faith, that thing of having doubts about his doubts and thinking that's a much more extraordinary reality, you know, would we be reading the Bible today? Would we have Christianity if there weren't extraordinary, brave people out there who believed it to be true? Maybe we wouldn't have it. Maybe it would have passed away like so many other religions that had their moment. So I think it needs to be believed as true by enough people for it to have any value and power, I think, for it not to be like a kind of political figure, for it to be something that is a different kind of truth than, I don't know, political party, whatever.
Good answer.
I mean, I'm assuming you were probably at church on Easter Sunday and took communion, I imagine.
Yes.
Is it, what is happening for you in that moment? Because as you said, you're a mixture of faith and doubt, and you know, it's not that you're sort of some sort of, I've got it all figured out at this point. But what's happening, I suppose, when you do that very physical, tangible thing of saying, this is the body and blood of Jesus, saying the words that come with the liturgy if you're in an Anglican setting, and kind of participating? Is it, what is that for you when you're engaging in that moment?
It's like joining in with a thing that's been continuous through a long period of time and sort of sinking down into that. And it's practicing a ritual with the hope that if you continually do that gesture, it does something. It's feeling more like I'm sharing in with the people around me. I don't know where I stand on transubstantiation or whatever, but I don't entirely know, you know. I'm not sure how much I'm... Yeah, I'm working it all out. I don't know yet.
I mean, I don't think that's a completely honest and understandable answer. I'm not sure I know exactly what's happening when I take communion. You know, it's a kind of, it is a mystery, right? I mean, that's the whole point of the thing.
Yeah.
I'm just really glad that you've written this book. As I say, not everyone's going to land in the same place where you land, but that's just the fact of the matter that we are also different, and we come at things in different ways. But what I really appreciated about the book, Lamorna, is just how gracious you are in the way you actually engage all those different traditions, and that the openness, in the sort of very open-handed way in which you kind of sort of want to explore, and just genuinely open and curious kind of, and the fact that you've been so candid and honest about the journey it's taken you on personally. As I say, I feel like I've been writing for a little while and charting as kind of what I've called the surprising rebirth of belief in God. And interestingly, a lot of the characters, and this is a criticism that a mutual friend of ours, Elizabeth Oldfield, sort of leveled at the book, it's focused a bit more on the kind of the conservative end of that, people who want to kind of reintegrate Christian values because they're worried about the direction the culture is going. But I think your story is symptomatic of the fact that there's actually a whole group of people who are seeking and spiritually thirsty, but who aren't necessarily going to be coming at it from the same direction as the aforementioned people like Jordan Peterson and so on. But I think underlying all of that is a search for a bigger story, that's kind of going on.
We just need a really big table to fit everyone on.
Well, maybe. Anyway, it's really, really encouraging to hear your story, and fascinating to kind of wander through it a bit with you.
Yeah, totally. We cannot recommend enough. Don't forget, we're here forever. A New Generation Search for Religion. And also Dark Salt Clear, Life in a Cornish Fishing Town, which, as someone from a fishing town, I have a little soft spot for. It's not a Cornish one, it's a Welsh one, but still, same. And thank you for joining us. We hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as we did. If you want to make future conversations happen, future re-enchanting conversations happen, seenandunseen.com/give. This conversation happened because of your generosity. So we would love to thank you for that.
But for now, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Lamorna, for being our guest
Thanks
on
for having
today's
me.
show. And we will see you next time.